The weight of his decision pressed on Brian Gardner's chest as he sat behind the wheel of the battered car, the pizza box beside him almost mocking his carefully cultivated persona. A billionaire, founder of a tech empire, yet here he was, a man of wealth disguised as a simple pizza delivery driver, preparing to meet the family of Nita Price, the woman he planned to marry. Brian had spent years building his empire, painstakingly crafting his reputation in boardrooms. But in this small suburban neighborhood, in the quiet home of Nita's parents, none of that would matter. They were humble folk. Hard-working, salt-of-the-earth types. And Brian, for all his success, couldn't shake the nagging fear that they might see him as arrogant, detached, or worse, simply unworthy of their daughter. "Focus," he muttered to himself, adjusting the cap he'd purchased for the occasion. It felt wrong, but it was necessary. Nita had warned him that her parents were suspicious of anything that seemed too flashy, too good to be true. And what could be more too good to be true than a billionaire showing up at their doorstep? He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, trying to summon some semblance of humility in his posture. He wasn't here as a CEO. He was just Brian, a man who loved their daughter and wanted to prove himself. As he approached the house, his heart beat faster, not from fear but from anticipation. This was the test. If he could make it through tonight without Nita's parents seeing through the disguise, it would be a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Price, a woman in her mid-50s, who looked nothing like the high society figures Brian was used to. She was warm, her eyes crinkling with kindness, completely unfazed by the delivery. "Pizza already?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as she took the box from him. "Yes, ma'am," Brian said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Your order." Inside, the conversation was light at first. Mrs. Price made small talk about the weather, a change of pace from the usual industry banter Brian was accustomed to. The dinner table was modest, and yet there was an unmistakable feeling of warmth and comfort in the air. For a moment, Brian allowed himself to relax. Maybe this wouldn't be so difficult after all. But then, the door opened again, and Nita stepped into the room. Her face, initially surprised, shifted into an expression of subtle recognition. Brian gave her a small smile, unsure of how to play it off. "Hi, Nita. The pizza's here." She nodded, trying to hide a laugh. "Right, the delivery guy." It was supposed to be funny, but even as they exchanged pleasantries, something seemed off. Brian could feel the weight of her gaze, the quiet understanding that this moment was far from ordinary. Her father, Mr. Price, entered next, his imposing presence filling the room. Brian tensed slightly, knowing the real challenge was about to begin. Mr. Price's sharp eyes scanned him from head to toe, and Brian couldn't help but feel as though the man could see right through the ruse. His polite greeting felt almost too deliberate, too measured. Brian could sense the scrutiny. "Sit with us," Mr. Price invited. "Don't stand on ceremony, delivery man." It was an odd invitation for a pizza boy, but Brian wasn't going to decline. He set the box down and joined them at the table, mentally preparing himself for the inevitable questions. As the evening wore on, Brian learned more than he had anticipated. The Prices were a family of resilient people who had faced hardship and found pride in their modest lives. There was a deep-rooted sense of humility in their conversation, a pride in the hard work they put into everything, from their small home to their jobs in the local community. But as much as he admired their values, he could sense the tension growing between Mr. Price and himself. The probing questions began innocently enough, but then Mr. Price's gaze became more calculating, his tone sharper. "So, delivery guy, huh?" Mr. Price said, setting down his fork and leaning back in his chair. "What do you do when you're not delivering pizzas?" Brian hesitated, the tension rising in his chest. He had rehearsed answers to questions like this, but they all felt hollow now. He wasn't used to lying, at least not like this. "Odd jobs," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual. "You know, whatever I can find." Mr. Price's eyes narrowed. "Odd jobs, huh? Doesn't seem like you're the type for that." His tone was skeptical, and Brian could feel his heart racing. His carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the charade. Before Brian could respond, the door slammed open with a force that made everyone jump. Nita's younger brother, Steve, stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," he demanded, ignoring Brian completely. The conversation abruptly shifted. Mr. and Mrs. Price excused themselves to follow Steve into another room, leaving Brian alone with Nita. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken words. Brian leaned closer to her, whispering, "Your dad suspects something. I think I've blown it." Nita bit her lip, clearly conflicted. "I told you this might happen," she whispered back. "My parents are sharp, Brian. They're not easily fooled." Brian's chest tightened. He didn't want to let her down. He had come here with the best of intentions, hoping to prove his worth without the shadow of his wealth hanging over him. But now he was starting to see how fragile that plan was. The raised voices from the other room grew louder, and Brian could hear the unmistakable sounds of an argument. Steve's accusations rang out, accusing their parents of favoring Nita, of giving her more attention and support while he struggled. It was clear that there were deeper issues at play here, issues Brian hadn't expected. "I think it's time I told them the truth," Brian said, looking at Nita with determination. "They need to know who I really am." Nita looked at him with wide eyes. "But they won't accept it, Brian. They don't care about money. They don't care about your success. They care about character." "I know," Brian said, his voice firm. "But maybe that's exactly what I need to show them." The evening had already been filled with unexpected twists, but nothing could have prepared Brian for what happened next. The argument between Steve and their parents seemed to escalate, with each word more cutting than the last. Brian could feel the tension in the air, thick with unresolved anger and hurt. He understood now that Nita's family had far more than just a reluctance to accept him. They were struggling in ways he hadn't imagined. Nita leaned in close to him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "They don't tell me these things, Brian. They've been hiding it from me, Steve, their financial issues, everything. I don't know what to do." Brian placed a hand on hers, his grip gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it alone, Nita. I want to help." Her eyes searched his face, doubt lingering in her expression. "How can you help, Brian? They won't accept charity." Brian understood her concern. This wasn't about giving them money, it was about restoring their dignity. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a way out. If they'll let me, I can help your dad find a job. I can help Steve with his business idea. But they have to trust me. And they can't trust me unless I'm honest with them." Nita looked torn, her lips trembling as she weighed his words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "You're right. They deserve the truth." With a steadying breath, Brian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked toward the room where the argument was still raging. Nita followed close behind, her hand resting on his arm as if to anchor him to the moment. They entered the small living room to find Steve pacing back and forth, his face flushed with anger, while Mr. and Mrs. Price sat on the couch, their faces creased with frustration. "I can't do this anymore," Steve was shouting. "You've always treated Nita like she's special, like she's the golden child. You never saw what I needed. You never saw me." Brian cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. "Mr. and Mrs. Price," he began, his voice steady. "Steve's right about one thing: you've always put Nita first. But I think there's something you don't know about me." Mr. Price looked up sharply, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What are you getting at, son?" Brian took a deep breath, steadying himself. "This was it. I'm not just some delivery guy, Mr. Price. My name is Brian Gardner, and He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'm the founder of a tech company. I'm wealthy, but that's not what matters here." There was a long pause. Mrs. Price's face went pale, and Steve's eyes narrowed in disbelief. Mr. Price's face hardened as he processed the words. "You're a billionaire?" Steve muttered, almost as if trying to make sense of it. Brian nodded. "Yes, but I'm not here because of my money. I'm here because I love your daughter and I want to be a part of this family. I didn't come here as a rich man because I wanted to prove something. I wanted to show you that I respect the values you have: humility, hard work. And I wanted you to know that I'm here to help, not to impress or take advantage of anyone." The room was silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Mrs. Price was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "But why? Why go through all this trouble? Why not just tell us who you were from the start?" Brian sat down across from them, his eyes softening. "Because I didn't want to be judged for my wealth, Mrs. Price. I wanted you to know me for who I am, not what I have. And I wanted to earn your trust, not expect it just because I'm rich." Mr. Price studied him for a long time, his face inscrutable. Finally, he sighed and leaned back, his shoulders slumping slightly as the tension seemed to dissipate from his body. "I didn't trust you at first," he admitted quietly. "I didn't want to like you. I thought you were just another rich kid playing at being humble." "I understand," Brian said quietly. I truly do. But Mr. Price continued, his voice growing softer. I see now you're different, and I respect that. I'm not sure what kind of help you can offer, but maybe we'll take you up on it. Brian exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. This was more than he had hoped for, more than he could have imagined. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Brian immediately set to work, not using his wealth as a crutch, but as a tool to help the Price family rebuild their footing. He helped Mr. Price polish up his resume using connections he had to set up interviews with some local companies that might offer him a stable job. He spoke with Steve about his business ideas, offering guidance and advice from his years of experience, but never once did he mention throwing money at the problem. For the first time in his life, Brian felt like he was part of something greater than himself. The small victories, like seeing Mr. Price light up after landing an interview, felt more fulfilling than any boardroom deal he had ever closed. And in the quiet moments, when the family sat together, sharing meals and laughter, Brian realized that he had gained something far more valuable than his vast fortune: the trust and acceptance of Nita's family. The emotional bond he was forming with her parents was the true reward. But even as things were improving, Brian couldn't shake a nagging sense of uncertainty. Was he truly earning their trust, or was he simply part of their struggle to stay afloat? He had crossed the threshold of honesty, but had they truly accepted him for who he was? The night before the wedding, Brian found himself standing alone on the porch of the Price house, looking out at the quiet street. Nita came up behind him, her presence warm and comforting. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, her voice soft. Brian turned to face her, his gaze intense. "I'm just thinking about everything that's happened. How far we've come in such a short time." Nita smiled, taking his hand in hers. "You've done more than I could ever have imagined. My parents trust you now not because of your money, but because of who you are." Brian's heart swelled at her words. "It wasn't easy, though. I had to face my own fears. I had to let go of the part of me that thought my success would speak for itself. But it's not about success, is it? It's about what we're willing to give to help others, to show who we really are beneath all the layers we hide behind." Nita squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with understanding. "You've proven yourself, Brian, more than anyone could have hoped for." The night air was cool, and the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze brought a sense of peace over him. Tomorrow they would marry. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Brian knew that he had finally found the kind of love he had always longed for, not just with Nita, but with her family as well. They had shared their struggles, their truths, and in the end they had formed a bond that went far beyond surface appearances. Brian and Nita's wedding was simple but beautiful, held in the backyard of the Price family home. The sun set behind them as they exchanged vows, surrounded by family and close friends. Brian had never imagined that his life would come to this, standing here, in the company of people who had initially seemed so different from his world. But as he gazed at Nita, at her parents, and even at Steve, who had quietly thanked him for his guidance in starting his own business, Brian felt a profound sense of belonging. After the ceremony, the reception was filled with laughter and music. Nita's family told stories of their life together, and though they were small, simple tales, they were laced with love and gratitude. Brian realized that, though he had entered their lives with a ruse, he had come to understand their true worth. It was in their struggles, their humility, and their devotion to one another that he had found what he had been missing all along. As the evening drew to a close, Brian stood with Nita, her hand in his, looking out over the gathering. "I never thought this would be my life," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I never thought I'd find a family like this. But I'm so glad I did." Nita rested her head on his shoulder, her smile soft. "We're your family now, Brian, and we love you just the way you are." And as the stars twinkled overhead, Brian realized that the road to love, trust, and redemption wasn't always smooth, but with the right people by his side, it was always worth the journey. So if you love the story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.